Ladies and gentlemen, there's an honor in Canada, which is our highest honor as a country, called the Order of Canada. And for those of you who are new to Canada, you might see a very small medallion which people who are awarded this by our country are entitled to wear at all times. When they get dressed up, they have big medals that they can wear, but generally you'll see the small pin for the Order of Canada. And we have several very distinguished Canadians amongst us as delegates and as speakers who wear the Order of Canada. One of those people is Robert Fulford. The award says to all Canadians, and thus to people of the world, this is a distinguished individual who has made an exceptional contribution to our country and to our country in the world. And Robert is, to me, a shining example of what the Order of Canada means. This is a gentleman who is an author of many books, and included in the works that he has written, of course, are his memories of Glenn Gould. I remember once he said to me, "John, I have nothing new to say about Glenn Gould," and I never believed that for a minute. But certainly there are Gould memories amongst Robert's writings. He's a distinguished lecturer, a teacher, and I particularly hear him in many areas where questions of ethics, particularly broadcast media journalism ethics are concerned, and his views are always very interesting there. But I guess for most of us today, the main reason we're interested to hear Robert speak is because he knew Glenn Gould so well. This is Glenn Gould's boyhood friend. This is the fellow who printed the tickets when the young Glenn Gould decided he wanted to have some concerts, and he needed somebody whom I can very well identify with, somebody who was the administrator, somebody who was there to help the creative person make things happen. And I think Robert has spent a lifetime, in a sense, living with Glenn Gould, both as someone he knew and also as a kind of legend who has grown both for Canadians and the world. And I know he's of interest to many of you because I keep a sort of list in my mind of the people that many of you and others like you who aren't with us say to me through emails or phone messages or letters, "Can you tell me about this individual?" or "Can I be in touch with this individual?" And one of the foremost individuals whom people want to hear from and to know from is indeed the distinguished Canadian Robert Fulford. And so to have Robert open formally in the discussion sessions and the speech sessions, to have him open the Glenn Gould Gathering is a great honor for those of us at the Foundation. Would you welcome Robert Fulford?
John, thank you for those extremely kind words. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here among Gouldonians in the Federal Republic of Gouldonia. I'm very grateful that the Foundation has asked me to be here. And I think maybe a good place to begin talking about Glenn Gould and radio, which is my topic, is a conversation I recall from 1949 and 1950, when we were 17 or 18 years old. In those days, half a century ago, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation put on the air live every Sunday night the concert of the Winnipeg Symphony, and I used to hear it and enjoy it a lot. And one time I said to Glenn that how much pleasure this concert gave me. I think it was 9 o'clock Sunday night. And I said, but it also aroused in me a feeling that I'm kind of embarrassed to talk about because it's sort of silly. And the feeling is, I'm speaking now of 1948 and 49. The feeling is of a kind of miracle of this distance. These people are sitting in a hall playing in Winnipeg, and I'm in Toronto hearing them, and I hear the audience, and I hear the orchestra. And it feels, that aspect of it is thrilling, as well as the musical aspect of it. And the reason I felt diffident about saying this to Glenn was Glenn had already demonstrated to all his friends what we might call his aggressive purity. And I said that to him, and he said, well, don't feel embarrassed or silly. That is thrilling. There is something marvelous in that, the fact of it. And I realized then that Glenn was alive to the miracle of sound from a distant place, the miracle that our generation inherited. He was open to the possibility of that being a beautiful experience, perhaps a transformative experience, perhaps an experience that would change people, because, of course, he was in the process of being changed himself, with results that we know quite well. The wonderful British essayist and philosopher Isaiah Berlin once wrote as follows: to know, to enjoy the friendship of a great man must permanently transform one's ideas of what human beings can be or do. Can be or do. If that is true, and I think it is, how much more true it must be if you know the great man when he's a boy, and when you also are a boy. That was my experience with Glenn. The result is that now, even all these years after our friendship, and all these years after his death, I find that my internalized relationship with him remains intense. So intense that there are times I can't bear to think about him, and there are other times I can't bear to think of anyone else. Robert Kraft says of Glenn, the best and perhaps the only way to discuss this extraordinary human being is through reminiscence. I disagree. I want to reminisce a little bit, but mainly I want to suggest the origins of some of Gould's thinking and sketch in the oral, the sound landscape in which he grew up. My argument centers on this idea. Gould's approach to the complexities of sound was in the beginning specific to our generation. His theories were grounded in perceptions of sound that were in a certain way available only to those born during one historical period. Marketing people love to tell us in their bizarre way that demography is destiny, that we act as we do because that's how our age cohort acts. Gould would have found that notion beneath contempt, and I certainly don't want to endorse it. He was a genius and therefore one of a kind. Nevertheless, his genius flowered at a certain moment in history in ways that the moment made possible. In this connection, I want to mention three separate events that occurred at roughly the same time. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt was elected President of the United States. In 1932, the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission was created by the federal government. In 1932, Glenn Gould was born. I see these events as a cluster. That presidential election was the first in which radio was a major factor, and Roosevelt was the first world historical figure who used radio with easy effectiveness. People hearing him understood that he was a new presence among the powerful. He was a political virtuoso of the microphone. And 9 years later, radio would be his great partner in unifying America against the Japanese and the Germans. Now, as to the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission, it was the first great cultural project of the federal government of Canada. It led 4 years later to the creation of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which soon had networks stretching right across the country. The idea behind this effort, this project, was to connect Canadians with each other and the world, to give Canadian artists a way to develop, and to make the talents of those artists available to all the citizens. Gould's career has many, many meanings, but one meaning of it can be summarized in a few words. He was, in his own person, the fulfillment of that grand cultural project. CBC Radio became the pipeline to his first audience. It became his relentless publicist, his laboratory, and often his employer. Its history and his will always be entwined to the credit of each. Gould and his contemporaries were the first radio generation and the last. I'm speaking of people born a few years before or a few years after 1930. When this generation awoke to the world, the radio was already turned on. The voices of radio speakers and singers were among the first human sounds we heard. In some cases, the influence could be prenatal, because we know that Florence Gould made it a point to listen to music on the radio during her pregnancy. Members of the radio generation developed an oral sensibility and an oral dependency that were both of them new in the world. We were the first to grow up with radio all around us, and we're pretty well the last to grow up without television. Radio provided the soundtrack of our lives, and as we grew toward maturity, if we were thinking of our circumstances and our place in history, we began slowly to understand the effects of radio. For example, it tended to obliterate distance, as between me and the Winnipeg Symphony. It offered rich, previously unheard of possibilities for access to information. It provided intellectual connections we wouldn't otherwise have dreamt of. It was an alternative center of existence. The first commercial broadcasting station in the United States went on the air in 1920 from Pittsburgh. Stations began popping up everywhere, including in Canada. But for years, radio remained an oddity. It was marginal. In 1926, the idea of the unified, self-conscious mass radio audience was still a futuristic proposal. And that year, Popular Mechanics magazine carried an article called, prophetically, Our Radio World of Tomorrow. It quoted Lee DeForest. He was the American whose inventions made radio possible. DeForest said, radio will be as much a commonplace with the next generation as the telephone is with this, lifting civilization to new levels. It sounded a little dubious. At that time, people were still fooling around with highly erratic cat's whisker crystal sets that they often built themselves. But just as that article was appearing, the manufacturers were working out radios that would not only be reliable, but would look something like living room furniture. In Washington, the U.S. government, under the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, was working with Westinghouse, GE, RCA, and AT&T to develop radio regulations. And that year set the pattern for the close ties between regulators and regulated that have ever since characterized the administrative environment of broadcasting. Something similar was happening in Canada, but it was happening more slowly. It was held back for a while by a question that the province of Quebec raised. Should the federal government be allowed to regulate broadcasting? It took the courts until 1932 to sort that out in the federal government's favor. And the act creating the Canadian Radio Broadcasting Commission finally went through. By the end of the 1930s and the end of the Depression, radio was mature, confident, and rich. Radio acting was an art, and radio drama was a branch of literature. Philip Roth, born 1933, recently wrote a novel centered on that world called I Married a Communist, in which he brilliantly captures the centrality of radio in our lives. Woody Allen, born in 1935, created a similar impression with his film Radio Days. These are in certain ways celebratory works of memory. But of course there was a sad human side to this brief history of radio. Many who organized their lives around it were betrayed by history. When television came in, they were pushed out, just as most of the silent movie actors had been pushed out of their business 20 years earlier. The fate of the radio people was like that of silent actors, but in reverse. With the silence, onrushing technology obliterated those who had learned only how to be seen. With radio, technology eliminated those who had learned only how to be heard. In Canada, the most notable victim of that kind was Andrew Allan. He was the Diaghilev of Canadian radio, the producer of the stage series in the 1940s, which was a Sunday night drama program that had a title like Stage 47, Stage 48, Stage 49. That series made him one of the culture heroes of the day, the leader of an elite corps of writers, actors, and musicians. On the stage series, many of us heard our first Shakespeare, our first Sophocles, our first Ibsen, and we also heard for the first time that Canadian writers were producing entertaining and socially engaging work. Glenn Gould, in a published interview, cited the stage program of 1946 as the beginning of his own serious interest in the possibilities of radio. Andrew Allan, in a melancholy passage of his memoirs, remembers that he left the series after stage 55, and he says this: "As young men, we had entered a young medium. It had seemed our lives were made for us. But suddenly the young medium had grown old. Television had descended," which is just an indication of how swiftly things were moving then, as they are now. In the early 1950s, around the CBC in Toronto, there was a lapel button, "Help Stamp Out TV." In 1955, Andrew Allan was not yet 50 years old, but he was finished. The spotlight had decisively swung over to television, and when he was deprived of the spotlight, he withered. For people who loved music, radio in those years was more important than it would be later, much more important than it is today. We depended on it if we wanted to hear music of any length. Our 78 RPM records were primitive, each disc only 3 to 5 minutes. The LP didn't reach the market until 1948, when Gould was 16. We were radio babies. That's the term that Gerald Nachman applies to us in his recent book, Raised on Radio. Radio inflected our language, informed our conversation, and shaped our dreams. It fed our ambitions. It told small-town kids they should move to the big city, and it told big city kids they should figure out what was on the other side of the horizon. We were too late for crystal sets, but still we experimented with sound in our own ways. Once under Glenn's direction, we set up an arrangement of tin cans and string that connected our adjacent backyards and was supposed to function as a primitive telephone. You had these tin cans and you spoke into it, and then you listened to it, and it was very hard to tell whether you heard the person from the other backyard through the tin can or through the normal method. I can't remember whether we decided it worked or not. But later, when we were about 12 years old, Glenn organized more sophisticated equipment, microphones and little speakers about that big. I don't know where he got them. And we could make radio broadcasts from our house to his house and vice versa. This time the equipment worked fine, but our problem was content. After he did a brief concert, and my brother Wayne and I did a newscast, we had trouble figuring out what to put on the air. In 1939, when we were 7 years old, radio found its one great subject, the Second World War. That war was for us an oral experience. Each bulletin, each change in the relationship between our side and the enemy came to us as sound waves. In Canada, we heard patriotic radio fiction about the war. For instance, L for Lanky, a dramatic series about the crew of a Canadian Lancaster bomber. The news for us was wrapped in the sonorous tones of Lorne Greene. Now, Lorne Greene later played Ben Cartwright on the TV series Bonanza. He was an announcer at the CBC, for a while the announcer at the CBC, and later he narrated the wartime documentaries of the National Film Board. His voice seemed to make all wartime news sound ominous. He could have made VE Day sound like a disaster. And so he was always called the voice of doom. He was part of our landscape. In the 1940s, now, when Glenn was beginning to understand radio and its possibilities, Harold Innis was one of the great figures in Toronto intellectual life. And in the next 2 decades, the theories that Harold Innis set in motion touched in some way every intellectual in this corner of the world. There was no escaping them, whether you chose to regard them as gospel truth or irrelevant academic fantasies. You could not live in Toronto in those years and talk with other intellectuals without stumbling across these ideas or their enemies or both. Gould was one of the people clearly affected. In that atmosphere, it was natural for anyone who was using the media or receiving the media in a serious way to wonder about the possibilities of the media. Where were they taking us? What would happen to us in this new age with this new, relatively new form of communications, radio? Harold Innis was an economic historian who had moved on from his studies of the fur trade and the cod fishery to write the history of cultures as they express themselves through their means of communication. To Innis, the history of communications was the history of civilization. He was working on the University of Toronto campus a few blocks away from where Glenn was studying at the Royal Conservatory. He brought out his key book in this field, Empire and Communications, in 1950. He analyzed the way media dissolve distances and the way media spread power. Of course, radio, being omnipresent at that moment, was frequently one of his subjects. He focused on the idea that we develop under the pressure of the particular ways we communicate, we being either individuals or societies. The fact that we read the newspaper or listen to the radio, he argued, may be more important than what the paper actually says or what the radio station broadcasts. This theory, which became in Harold Innis a conviction, developed into the phrase Marshall McLuhan made famous, the medium is the message. Innis influenced McLuhan, whose ideas have since the 1950s become so commonplace that they are often used today by people who have no idea where they originated. McLuhan's theories and his practice, I believe, helped legitimize Gould's work in Gould's own eyes. In the years when the Solitude trilogy was appearing, the idea of North, the latecomers, and the quiet in the land, critics and audiences sometimes found the overlapping voices and apparently unresolved themes more baffling than stimulating. Gould could take heart from the fact that people said the same thing about McLuhan's work. Moreover, McLuhan, as a student of modern literature, emphasized process rather than product, and claimed to be opening up any given subject rather than delivering the last word on it. Wasn't this also what the Solitude trilogy was all about? Last year, the distinguished British theorist of urban life, Peter Hall, directed our attention to this phenomenon in his book, Cities and Civilization, a massive survey of cities as culture generators through history. He devoted a section to what he called Innes, McLuhan, and the Toronto tradition. And that was the tradition in which Gould became an adult. Long before that school of thought arose, history and geography had forced communications onto the national agenda. Canada had always seen communications as a central issue and had made public radio a national policy. To anyone who was at all culturally ambitious, the CBC was a crucial institution, as no similar network was in the US. And radio was important to us in a way that it never was to Americans. Now, in the US, radio drama flourished, and every musical American thought the world of the Toscanini broadcast or the Metropolitan Opera broadcasts. But in Canada, radio had those meanings for us and many more. We tended to believe that we needed public radio to pull together the isolated population centers across the continent. Many of our generation have said they drew their first sense of Canada from listening to the radio. Incidentally, we also believed firmly that, as we insistently put it, radio frequencies are public property. We used to say that quite often. Radio frequencies are public property. That phrase reveals our age if we say it now, because hardly anyone under 50 believes it for a minute. Most people have long since learned that radio frequencies belong to station owners and bureaucrats. The public's role, if it has a role, is to choose among the offerings presented. But I stress that in the period I'm describing, Gould and most of the people he knew assumed they could shape broadcasting in this country for the benefit of the people and the culture. When his sensibility was developing under the influence of Canadian radio, he, like all of us, was listening to American radio as well. The networks all came into Toronto from Buffalo, and some individual stations too. So we were living imaginatively in two cultures and two political worlds, which I think is probably the place where anyone who wants to understand Canada has to begin. It lives in two worlds at once, at least two. I remember the excitement with which Glenn and I heard the 1948 Republican National Convention, which nominated Thomas Dewey. I don't know why we cared. Perhaps we listened the way you might listen to a basketball game, but I can remember Glenn coming out of his house, writing on a piece of paper. He'd just taken a break from the piano, he checked the radio, and he had the delegates, number of delegates for Taft, number for Dewey, whatever. I think there was a third person. He had it written down, figuring out how the rest of the afternoon would go. Many Canadians have the same experience of overlapping nationalities, but our generation was the first one that could switch from nation to nation with the twist of a dial. America was the great inventor and generator of mass culture. Excuse me. Toronto was the place to watch America. That was the key to what McLuhan and his colleagues were doing. They were absorbing American mass culture, but they were not of it. It was not theirs. They took it seriously without feeling directly responsible for it. In a curious way, their approach combined immersion with detachment. And where those intellectuals went in that period, popular artists have more recently followed. This same situation is the reason Canada produces so many comedians, Mike Myers, Jim Carrey, and many others. They grow up absorbing American culture, but separate from it, so that they can see it well enough to imitate, manipulate, and exaggerate its characteristics. Gould sometimes gave copies of McLuhan's books to friends, and at his death he owned 7 of them, including the classic, the important books, Understanding Media and the Gutenberg Galaxy. And the appreciation didn't flow just one way. there's a book by McLuhan called Counterblast, in which he blasts and blesses different things. And one line in it says, "Bless Glenn Gould for throwing the concert audience into the junkyard." Some years ago, when the late Otto Friedrich was appointed Glenn's official biographer, a friend of mine interviewed him for a newspaper piece. She said she imagined he would be pursuing the development of Glenn in what she described as McLuhan's Toronto with the CBC and all it implies and so on. And Friedrich said no, he didn't see how that had any part in it. And that was the first hint I had that Friedrich, whose work I admire very much in other fields, was not the ideal Gould biographer. Our generation's sense of the incongruous came from radio. The commercial placed next to the melodrama, the war bulletin followed by the Pepsodent commercial. That fed the sense of humor Gould expressed through mimicry and through inventing character types and giving them satirical dialogue, which I'm sure everyone here has read about or even experienced on sound or in person. Today, no one over the age of 3 would notice all those juxtapositions, but they were new as radio delivered them to us. Radio, in fact, was a new environment, and our parents found it strange, and we found ourselves swiftly growing familiar with it. Sometimes radio felt like conversations overheard, and we in our youth could feel a little like eavesdroppers. We were the first children in the history of the world who could routinely listen to the talk of adults without anyone knowing we were there. And there was something wonderful about radio's random quality. Its ability to surprise us in the middle of the night with a station we'd never heard of or a piece of music that was otherwise beyond our knowledge and experience. In this context, try to imagine how predictable the actual world around us appeared to be. I mean, at the time, true, Europe was going through a monstrous war and then a monstrously difficult recovery period, which involved many of our friends and relatives, and of course we knew all about it. But the place we lived in was rather plain, a rather flat world, unconscious in its smugness, overly rationalized in its daily life. Perhaps we could take a trip to the library or the music store, and that could lead to an adventure through which we might escape, but it was an organized adventure. Radio, on the other hand, seemed to spring out of nowhere, bringing us strange voices in the night. From quite early, Gould understood that he and the age of electronic media were made for each other. In a 1959 interview for the CBC with Vincent Tovell, he remarked that his spirit required time out of touch with the world, when the world was shut out from his consciousness. By that he meant the world right around him. But how did he acquire this time shut off from the world? He said, "I obtained it through media. And I would have been unhappy as a 19th century man." A most interesting comment, I thought. We can isolate the qualities of radio that particularly appealed to him while they were helping shape him. Radio, especially in the night, conveyed a deep sense of solitude. It was the medium for loners, the consolation of outsiders, the friend of the alienated. As he was to say years later, isolation is the indispensable component of human happiness. Moreover, radio was disembodied, invisible, appealing to the side of Glenn that tilted toward the abstract, the part of him that refused bodily engagement. There was something else. As the biographers write, and as the friends and acquaintances testify, Glenn had trouble with human communication. Not always, of course, but often enough for it to be notable. There's a paradox here. He was a pioneer communicator. He spoke with an eager fluency and great wit. And of course, his music speaks eloquently to us and probably will speak eloquently to the future. And yet, making human connections was not easy for him. It's not easy for anyone now that I think of it, but it was very hard for him. In thinking about it now, I want to add parenthetically that I regret the way we, I don't mean any particular person, but the way we in Toronto, people who knew him, people who knew about him, I regret the way we joked lightheartedly about his eccentricities. Mind you, he would not have wanted us to do otherwise. He would not have wanted us to spend our time psychoanalyzing him. He did not cry out for understanding. Even so, in retrospect, and only in retrospect, there seems to be a vein of unconscious and unintended cruelty in our view of him as a kook. Of course, he was not a kook, he was not eccentric. He was a great artist in great emotional difficulty for much of his life. We understand now that those eccentricities that we found so charming were strategies for dealing with extremely deep, serious trouble. On CBC Radio a couple of years ago, Dr. David Goldblum, the medical director of the Clark Institute for Psychiatry in Toronto, speculated that in all the accounts we have of him, Glenn demonstrates a total absence of reciprocity. I thought that was an amazingly good phrase, a total absence of reciprocity. That doesn't mean he was never kind, and it does not mean he never understood others. It means he did not understand others reciprocally, which Dr. Goldblum went on to say is what people want more than anything else in the world, reciprocal understanding with others. Glenn had empathic failure, an inability to understand the world as others see it. And this was said by Dr. Goldblum in a discussion of Peter Ostwald's deeply sympathetic biography, Glenn Gould, The Ecstasy and Tragedy of Genius. Peter Ostwald knew for many years that something was terribly wrong with Glenn and that this something tormented him, while onlookers were satisfied to conclude tolerantly that Glenn's style of life, and this is how I say I think we're mistaken, we were satisfied to conclude tolerantly that Glenn's style of life was just another way of being human. Glenn, we now understand, often experienced it as a nightmare. Ostwald suggests that perhaps his condition was a version of Asperger's syndrome, a kind of autism that's compatible with intellectual gifts and accomplishments. This doesn't really explain a great deal, but it gives a label to Glenn's apparent inability to read other people's desires or emotions. In that, then, we can see some of the appeal of radio. In radio, in making radio, Glenn could carefully shape his communications with others. And in fact, he could control what they said as well, down to the last cough, eliminating the possibility of any dangerous human interaction of a spontaneous kind. Radio had a more obvious attraction. It was a medium for an individual. It reinforced in the happiest way anyone's sense of separation from the surrounding community. To go to church was to join with those of your neighbors. To go even to the movies was something similar. A concert likewise. Radio helped create mass culture, true, but it could intensify individual identity. It was a medium for individuals, and it often gave the impression of one voice speaking to one pair of ears. In fact, when you're learning radio, people often say, remember, you're not talking to a hall full of people, you're talking to one person. Ever since the Renaissance, the great psychological project, the great accomplishment of Western civilization has been the development of the individual self. This was the glory and the burden of history, the glory and burden that was prepared for us. What Saul Bellow calls in Herzog this great bone-breaking burden of selfhood and self-development, the load placed on individuals in an age of unbelief. Now, radio was suggesting new forms that this development of individualism could take. Gould, no question about it, wanted to assume this burden in his own way. Occasionally, like McLuhan, he would show a certain lingering affection for pre-modern civilization. And I noticed in one of the French films I was looking at yesterday in the Graham Spry Theater, down the hall, he's saying something. He's talking about Orlando Gibbons and how much he loved Orlando Gibbons' work, and he's saying that Orlando Gibbons had one foot in the pre-Renaissance world of individualism and one foot in the Renaissance. And Glenn seems to be saying that that is a very sympathetic place to be, but he seems to be saying that there is something beautiful in those composers pre-Renaissance who were lacking in individual identity, but whose music achieved greatness of various kinds. And he then says the strangest thing for anyone in our tradition, anyone who's lived with great names and who has become, by this time that the French film was made, become a great name himself. He says, things went wrong when composers started to think about identity. In other words, from the Renaissance onward. But he wanted to, most of him, that's one part of him, most of him wanted to assume the burden of selfhood. He wanted to do it in his own way. He grew up in a home that was almost fanatic in its devotion to the ordinary. And he was desperate to break from it, desperate to find himself intellectually. Moreover, he wanted to urge the same course on everyone else. There's a piece that Sanford Schwartz wrote for the New Republic in the 1980s, in which he said that what he gets from all the interviews of Gould, all the interviews with Gould, of which we know there are a multitude, and I don't think I've ever read one that wasn't interesting, but Schwartz says what those interviews send out is a call to individuality. He wants people to do what they want regardless of what everyone out there says they should do or think. So those voices on the radio coming from nowhere, unique and unpredictable, inspired his own experiments with radio later, when he went into the CBC studios and invented his contrapuntal radio documentaries as the Solitude Trilogy. Vincent Tovell has recalled that Glenn became his own producer, quote, his own producer in radio, and he mastered the business of taking a microphone and recording what he wanted to record, when and where he wanted. He was extraordinarily good at extracting material from people in conversational situations, Vincent goes on, and then removing his own voice and, in fact, making his own program compositions. Glenn described the preparation of these programs once. He said he would take an interview from here, an interview from there, then he'd pull a phrase out of this one, pull a phrase out of that one, he'd accentuate that one, he'd throw in some reverb, adding a compressor here, a filter there, and he would take a sound as short as a chuckle and move it around a program until he had it where he wanted it. Of course, he did all this with the analog system of tape recording, and probably it took him 10 times as long to do it as it would take him today with the digital system. God knows how many radio programs he would do, and how many critics he would infuriate today. Of course, every time I see something electronic come on the market or emerge, I think of what Glenn might have done with it, as I'm sure most of the people in this room do at one time or another. Jeffrey Peasant, who was his first biographer, called those radio programs a kind of sculpture in recorded sound. Peasant noted something that I don't think I understood it until he wrote this down. There was about 10 years, up to 1979, when making piano records was the second most important thing in Glenn's life. And the most important thing was the series of radio documentaries. What I've tried to suggest is that he was the first great artist formed specifically by radio in the radio generation, and he was the first one who, as radio died away, persisted for decades in working with radio, his first medium, and making it in his own way, his own art form. Well, I've saved for the end of my talk a little story about Glenn and radio, a story that signifies nothing earth-shaking, proves nothing, but does provide a glimpse of his humor and his curiosity, particularly about what might call the oddities to be discovered in everyday life. I don't think that Glenn had a day in his entire life when something of that kind did not attract him. On this particular day, well, incidentally, telling this story, I have to invent a proper noun because I can't remember the correct one. The name of a business establishment. This particular day, Glenn and I, teenagers, were staying at his family's cottage up by Aurelia. We were having lunch when he looked at the clock, and then he jumped up and turned on the radio. Hold it, he said, you've got to hear this. He turned on the Aurelia radio station, which was just finishing the noon news bulletin. Here it comes, Glenn said. There then issued from the radio a passage of intensely, painfully lugubrious organ music. The organ then faded, and the same announcer came on, the same fellow who'd been giving the news a minute ago, but his manner was now quite different. Where he was crisp and urgent when giving the news, now he was solemn and stately. And he said, McReynolds Funeral Home presents today's death notices. And you could see that Glenn loved the earnestness of it, the stateliness and the music. And it was certainly a novelty to me, death notices on the radio, and I laughed, but Glenn said, shh, wait a minute. Then organ music swelled, and then it faded to the background, and the announcer said, there are no death notices today. Organ up. And Glenn said, that's the part I always like best. So then the organ became background once more, and the announcer said, this program has been brought to you by the McReynolds Funeral Home. And that was the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Robert's been good enough to say he would stay for a few more minutes if there are indeed some questions from the floor or some comments. You should know that as a school teacher, I never think that a period of silence with no questions is a bad thing. Whenever I was in this situation, I always felt it meant that the lesson was well taught. Why don't you come out to the microphone? Vern, I see you. Martin, come on out to the microphone, and we'll take your questions there so everyone can hear. Vern Edquist.
Thank you, John. What a wonderful memory. Bob, thank you.
Thank you.
And for a young guy growing up on the prairie and hearing those mounted police bulletins coming over the radio saying that 3 dangerous convicts had escaped from Prince Albert Penitentiary. Boy, the theater of the mind was really stimulated.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I should note the questioner was Glenn's piano tuner for 35 years.
And the microphone stage left, Martin Smith, BBC Wales.
Hi there. I think you've written previously that even as a child, Glenn Gould was isolated because he was working like hell to become a great man. Do you think that he achieved it?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part.
Did he achieve becoming a great man?
Oh, yes, I think so.
Why?
I think so. Well, I think that he did what many artists hope to do. He defined a certain sphere of culture for his generation, and then it turned out it wasn't for his generation, it was for his generation and also the next generation, and then maybe another half generation after. That is greatness among the performing artists, I think. He then, of course, he taught everyone a different approach to recording music. He taught us all to consider certain issues of recording in a different light. In those different ways, I think he made a great contribution. But of course, I'm not a musician. There are people here who could define his greatness 1,000 times better than I could. Probably half the people in this room could do that.
Didn't you write somewhere, I think in the Globe and Mail, that your relationship with Glenn broke down somewhere around 20 years old or something? With retrospect now, how can you explain that quick end?
It was when we're not 20 years old, it was more like 27 years old. It wasn't quick, it was slow. I irritated him, and he irritated me. At different times, we both had a little cause of irritation. Neither of them was very important, and yet seemed a little important at the time. And I gave an interview about him in which I told one little story, which he found hideously embarrassing. I thought it was just an example of Glenn's exuberance, which I was used to for 15 years, or whatever, maybe a bit more than that. But he played for me a piece by Rosalind Turek, and he played his recording of the same piece. I wish I could say for Kevin and other historians here, I wish I could say what the piece was, but it does not stay with me. He played the Turek record, and he played a recording he'd made, and he explained to me how his was better. And I just thought that, I was terribly impressed. By the time that I'm speaking of, we knew that he was an international figure in the piano. This is not. But I was always deeply impressed by how confident he was in the beginning. He spoke of the musicians of the world, the great musicians of the world, as if he was one of them, long before they'd heard his name. I've known other artists who've done that, and they were wrong. So I irritated him. Later, I was editing a magazine, and he wrote a piece for me, and then he read it on the radio a couple of weeks before I got it into print, which is really against the rules. But did he not know the rules, or was he just mad at me from years before? I don't know. But there's something much more important here. A friend of his said to me, the hardest thing I did in my life was maintain my friendship with Glenn. He said, I loved him, I admired him, and the hardest thing I did in my life was to maintain my friendship with him. Why was it so hard? Well, the phone rings at 3 a.m. You pick it up and you say, and Glenn says, have you got a minute? Of course you have a minute, which you had intended to be sleeping through, but this friend of mine went through that. He just said, well, I don't care. I'm doing it. I'm putting up with it. Now, he didn't have children. I think he didn't have children. I had around the time, in my late 20s, I had 2 children. By age 27, a furiously busy career. My marriage. I didn't have the time to make the effort. It would have taken those 2 irritations were not anything to break a friendship over, but they took some smoothing over, and it would have taken energy from one side or the other, and I didn't have it to give. So we were only rarely in touch after that. I felt very guilty about it and still don't feel well about it. But on the other hand, I feel a little consoled when I realize it happened to almost everybody else at one time. Not everybody else, almost everybody else.
Mr. Fulford,
Mr. Posen, good morning.
Good morning. Mr. Fulford, you and many others, including Glenn, have pretty much unanimously concluded that Glenn espoused isolation and expound on its virtues, and claimed that isolation was important to him. I would like to propose the thought that Glenn didn't at all live an isolated life, that he lived a very gregarious life, one that wasn't a conventionally gregarious life, but one that was nonetheless very social and very gregarious. It was done very much under his control, and you have talked about his control, but I would appreciate your comment on the question of whether or not isolation truly expresses what it was that he was about.
That's a very shrewd comment. I would say that on that, just as on the Middle Ages, only it's much more important, he was extremely ambivalent. He would say that isolation is important. He would say that, and then he'd write it down. Isolation is vital to human happiness. It was vital to him, he would say. And yet we know he was on the phone for 4 hours, or maybe 7 for all we know. I mean, we don't have a log, but we know that he would be on the phone for hours at night. That he did write a lot of letters. He received a lot of letters, and he did make various connections with people. But there was this other element, which Ostwald defines, and which Goldblum called a lack of reciprocity. He had that as a problem. And that's why the word tragedy is in Ostwald's title. It's not tragedy that he died so young. That's tragic. That's would have been much better if we had another 30 years of him, better for everybody. But the fact is, I was interviewing. I was interviewed by Ostwald, and we talked about this. And my feeling is, to accomplish so much as he did, where's the tragedy in that? And Ostwald was saying the tragedy is in the failure to interact with other people. That is tragic, especially for a great soul, as Glenn was, who understands such matters intuitively when he doesn't necessarily articulate them. He does intuit what's going on. So, I agree with you and disagree with you on that point. Sir.
Yeah, I enjoyed what you had to say about Glenn as a product of the radio age, and I know that was your theme. But did he not grow with equal ease and success into the television age? All his television documentaries, performances, interviews, and so on. Maybe for another talk.
Well, he appeared often on television, and of course. In France, as well as France and elsewhere, as well as in Canada, and there you can see all those wonderful programs that are running continuously. But he was not the maker of the television. He was not in charge of it. Television, and this is what absolutely scared and baffled, frustrated many of the people who had learned radio. Television cost about 18 times as much. Was much, much harder to do, and at the end of the day might not produce that effective a piece. So the idea, you cannot sit by yourself and with one operator in a room and put together pieces of a television program after having, you cannot go out all by yourself, especially in the 60s, 50s or 60s. It's a little easier now, but you can't go out with your own camera, as he went out with his own microphone, and interview these people. It's impossible. Radio was almost, though it seemed a big and glamorous thing when I was young, it now seems like a cottage industry. There's this one fellow standing on, it's just one fellow interviewing one other person, and then he goes into a studio with one operator, and then they fit it together, and then they have a program. Well, the equivalent in television will probably involve 40 or 50 people. Glenn was not the kind of Diaghilev type of organizer of masses of people. I don't think, he might have made himself that had he wanted to badly enough, I don't know. But he didn't, he wasn't, and he didn't. So television for him was a medium. Vincent Tovell wrote about this also, about how television for him was something to be on. It was not something he could take charge of. Yes, sir.
Clearly, Glenn Gould was a very unusual person and a wonderful human being. But there's one word that I notice in this meeting people shy away from, and that's genius. And in particular, musical genius. Now, I would like to have your opinion, sir, as to how does he rate as a musical genius, and what would have made him that, or what did make him that?
On this subject, I have only two things to say. One is Glenn mistrusted the word genius very much. I don't know whether one should apply it to him. But secondly, most of the people in this room can answer that question with more authority than I can. My guess is no. No. If Beethoven's a genius, Bach is a genius, no. The answer is no. On the other hand, think of how we use the word genius so lightly sometimes compared to many people I've called a genius. She sure is. So I don't know.
I'd just like to say one clarifying thing. Glenn did actually say to me that he would really love to be, and he wanted to be, a television producer. He was quite frustrated with television because, unlike radio, where it's easy to experiment and to manipulate and try all sorts of things, this was not possible in television.
Also in radio, failure is not such a calamity.
Exactly.
Oh.
And there is the cost factor. I mean, once the rehearsals started, the dollars were ticking over.
Sure.
And he said to me one day, what CBC needs is an experimental studio. I need a studio where I can go and experiment and try all kinds of things, try things out. And from the best of that, I know what to do. But he always had to try and get someone else to accept his ideas and to make use of them. Of course, he was performing, but he had conceptualized the production, and he didn't always get back the production which he had hoped to achieve, and this was his big frustration. But of course, had he lived, this might have become possible.
And of course, if he lived in the 90s, he would discover that television is an awful lot cheaper in many, many respects than it was in his day. So you're not in the period you're talking about, if you say, I want to do a television show, they expect a program at the end of it. The people who put the money into it, you can't say it didn't work.
No.
Which you could with radio sometimes.
Yes, this is true. And even with radio, with such things as digital technology, I said to him, you're going to have to re-record many things that you've done and do them digitally. And he looked at me and he said, well, I don't think so. He said, I was very happy with Dolby, very happy to have Dolby. But he said, I think what I've had to say with these things I've said, and I was happy to re-record the Goldbergs, but I don't want to record anything else, and I just think the world's going to have to live without Glenn Gould and digital.
One more question.
Okay, I just have two points. First, I want to congratulate you. Brilliant, beautifully presented speech.
Thank you very much.
And as you know, I'm from Philadelphia, and I think we in the States could benefit from hearing your opinion of, a Canadian's view of the States, and also everything you said about radio was just wonderful. I just want to address again the issue of what you call Glenn's lack of reciprocity, and just to present the point that if this in fact was true, and I know all of the arguments about his controlling conversations and all of that, how was he then able to draw out of the people that he interviewed for the documentaries the things that he needed to get from them? I mean, people on these documentaries are so comfortable speaking. Of course, he's rearranged a lot of things afterwards to present his own point of view, but he must have had and many people have told me this, a tremendous warmth, an ability to communicate. I know he probably took over a good part of conversation, but he also must have been a stupendous listener to be able to get the kinds of things back that he did. So I don't know if you want to address that or not.
Well, in saying what I said and quoting those remarks about lack of reciprocity, inability to communicate both ways and so on, I didn't mean to suggest that he didn't have fantastic charm, great curiosity, great sympathy. All those things were there. It's not a question. And if he were to interview 10 people from this room today, and spend the rest of the day here interviewing, probably 7 of those people would give the best interviews they gave of their lives. He had patience. Another thing about television, by the way, just to go back to that previous theme, with a radio tape, you can run it forever. There's no crew who says we're on our lunch hour is in 5 minutes. I mean, so he could just go on forever with that, and he did want those interviews very much. He certainly, and he was not someone who ever. You could never predict that. Well, he was never uninterested in people standing around. He was interested in people standing around. And you know, in 32 short films about Glenn Gould, the first film, the first item, is totally fictional. It's his last concert in California, and he speaks to the stage manager before he goes out, and the stage manager starts telling him something, and Glenn says, well, how would that work out with that? Well, what about your pension? And the interesting thing is, I like that film as a whole, but that was entirely made up by McKellar and Gerard when they're making the film. They just made it up, and it was the truest thing in the film. It was, as I heard Fiore saying those words, I thought, it's exactly the way Glenn spoke to someone, some total stranger, stage managers. He speaks exactly that way. And I thought, you know, the truth, again, for the truth, you have to go to the fiction. Well, thanks very much.